We looked at the 5 type of offerings that the Israelites were to offer depending on, whether it's a peace offering or grain offering or sin offering or whatever. And then we started looking at the particular feast days that they were to observe. We looked at last week's, which was the most important for them, and that was the Day of Atonement. That takes place in late September, early October for our calendar. And we talked about its significance and what had to be done on that day and the order that it had to be done in, the type of sacrifices. And this was the one day out of the 365 days that the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, the most holy place. No other time was anybody ever allowed to go in it. And he could only go in it, remember, under special conditions. He had to light the censer so that there would be this kind of a smoky fog type look in the most holy place, so that he didn't get to see things very clearly when he was. He was in and out of it several times during the day for different purposes. Well, tonight I want to do the second feast day, if we want to call it that. And this was Passover, the one that we read about a lot in the New Testament. It was, as far as the year goes, their year, it was the first of 3 great feast days that the men were to go to Jerusalem to observe. And it took place on the 14th of their first month, which would be about like our March/April. And this, of course, goes all the way back to what happened when the Israelites were getting ready to leave Egypt. All right? That's basically what it's all about. But first of all, let's look at Leviticus 23. And if someone would read verses 4 through 8. Leviticus 23, verses 4 through 8.
These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations, which you will proclaim at the time appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work, but you shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the 7th day is the holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work.
All right. Passover, notice the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were basically all connected. And sometimes in the New Testament, when it says Passover, it's talking about the entire 8 days. In other words, the 1 day of Passover, the 7 days of unleavened bread. So that would include then a Sabbath day, all the way including the next Sabbath day. So sometimes you just have to look at the context to see whether it's talking about just the 1 day, actually Passover, or the entire 8-day feast. Because sometimes it's talking about the entire thing. Jesus, of course, being Jewish, he observed these days. He observed Passover. He observed the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we'll talk about where those come from and their significance in a minute. But it was a very, very important time. Notice the Feast of Unleavened Bread began and ended with what was called a holy convocation. In other words, it was like Sabbath rest. They were not to do any work on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the last day. Neither one. All right, let's go back to where this all began, which is in Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12. Oh, okay. Okay. Here's some of the things that was to happen. And this is where it all began. Remember, they're in Egypt. They're slaves. They've already had 9 of the 10 plagues. Notice chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So at this point in time, the Jewish calendar changed. All right? It changed. They didn't even call it the same thing anymore. Even in Hebrew, they changed the name of the month. Okay? So up until this time, one calendar with certain names for the months, and then they changed it with this time period. Okay? So a lot of things revolved around Israel leaving Egypt. Yeah, your Bible's right there, sweetie. Revolved around Israel leaving Egypt. And one of the things was the calendar changed. And it was because that's when they left Egyptian bondage. So they started their calendar now with basically the month they were going to leave Egypt. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. Okay, so it was to be for each household. And sometimes, depending on the size of the household, sometimes several households could go together and do it as one, if they were small households. And it was to be a lamb, and if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish. So here was some specific instructions. It was to be without blemish. It was to be a male, and it was to be of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. It had seemed like most people did it from the sheep, but it could be from the sheep or the goats. It didn't make any difference. God said you could do either one. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. So they took it on the 10th, and then on the 14th, this is what happened. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. So that's when everybody did it. They picked it out of the flock on the 10th, and then on the 14th at twilight, then that's when they were to kill it. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. So they were to take some of the blood of that lamb, spread it on the 2 sides and the top. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, which was important, as we'll see in a little bit, with unleavened bread, which had significance, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. All of those things had significance, and they were symbolic of things that were going to happen in the New Testament times. So, even though this was, 1,500 years before the time of Christ, well, more than that, it had some symbolism for things that were going to happen during the time of Christ. So, you're not to eat it raw, he says, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire. So, they weren't even allowed to choose how to cook it. They were told specifically you had to cook it one way. You had to roast it in fire. Its head with its legs and its entrails. So all of that. The head, legs, the insides, everything. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it. with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, so you shall eat it in haste. It's the Lord's Passover. So they were to eat it ready to go out the door. Sandals on their feet, staff on their hand, belongings ready to go. So this was a meal that they were to eat quickly because they had to get out of town fast. So that's why they had to be prepared. So it's the Lord's Passover. Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. So God Himself was going to pass through the land. Okay, it wasn't some sort of death angel or anything else. It wasn't a disease that was going to come through. It was the Lord Himself that was going to pass through and execute judgment, He said. This is God speaking, and God said, I'm going to pass through the land. He said, I'm going to do it myself. And He says, now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Of course, the 10th plague was going to be the death of the firstborn. And not just people. It was going to be the cattle as well. So, an enormous amount of mourning and suffering and death was going to happen. But there was a purpose to it. That's what's important. There was a great need for it, because, as he's going to say, it was going to be a memorial. Why do we have Memorial Day every year? What's its purpose? It was a way to remember them, right? Way to remember them. Okay. So that's what this was. This was a way for them to remember every year what they had gone through. And by doing this year after year after year, then every generation learned from the prior generation about what had happened in Egypt years and years and years ago. And so you think about all the years from here to the time of Christ, because Christ observed it. You know, when He went into Jerusalem, remember, that was when He was, He told them to go prepare a lamb. Told 2 of His apostles, go prepare a lamb. So He observed it. So think about all the years that the people remembered what had happened in Egypt. People forget. If they're not reminded, people forget. And of course the Lord's Supper is for that purpose. It's a reminder. It's a memorial to remember what happened in the first century. Well, the Passover was for God's people to remember what He had done for them in Egypt by passing over them and not destroying their firstborn. So He says, verse 14, so this day shall be to you a memorial, and you'll keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. So every year, on the 14th of the month, of the first month, do this. Year after year after year, they were to do it. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. They would be killed. They would be killed. Well, let's go on before I talk any more about that. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. On the seventh day shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations, and as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. Since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he's a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. And typically the head of the household would go throughout the entire house searching for any leaven. I mean, even a little bit of leaven. So they would go everywhere trying to find leaven and then get rid of it. Because they didn't have time when they left Egypt for the yeast to rise. So that's why they had flatbread. There was no leaven. And so this was another reminder that not only did God pass over their houses, but also that God got them out of Egypt quickly. And so when they, during this 7 days, when they didn't eat unleavened, or when they didn't eat any leaven, only ate unleavened bread, it reminded, the generation was reminded. God got them out of Egypt and got them out quickly. And of course, quickly meaning safely as well. So that leaven, leaven, typically wherever you find it, especially in the Old Testament, leaven is usually bad. Leaven usually represents something bad, and typically it's a symbol of sin. Sin, evil. And so things that had yeast in them, like that, were typically, that was a symbol of something that was corruptible. So since yeast gets in and causes a change in the bread, it's greatly different, then that act where something works from the inside, then leaven is used to show how sin can corrupt and changes things from the inside. So leaven typically is symbolic of sin. And in the Old Testament, when leaven is put away, it's a symbol of putting away sin. And he even uses that a couple of places in the New Testament we'll see here shortly. But there's something else about the Passover, also, beginning in verse 21. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that's in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that's in the basin, and none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning." So they were told what to use to wipe the blood on the doorpost, and also that they couldn't leave their house, not until the morning. They had to stay within it if they were going to be safe. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be, when your children say to you, "What do you mean by this service?" that you shall say, "It's the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households." So the people bowed their heads and worshipped, and the children of Israel went away and did so just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And that's where it came from. That's where it came from. We find that They were also to put bitter herbs in it. And we find that, I think, in the next chapter mentions that as well. They were to eat Passover lamb with bitter herbs. Well, the bitter herbs was a reminder of how bitter those times were and what they had to go through, Egyptian slavery and bondage and what they had to do. It was a reminder of that bitter time. So the leaven, the lamb, the blood on the doorpost, the bitter herbs, they were all symbolic. Just like our supper, the elements are symbolic. They have spiritual meaning. That's why we don't change them. That's why the Israelites were not allowed to change anything in the Passover, because those things had spiritual significance. That they had meaning. The bitter herbs, the blood, the lamb, all of it had spiritual significance. Well, our unleavened bread has spiritual significance. The fruit of the vine has spiritual significance. So, in many ways, we are following them as far as we're not to change the Lord's Supper any more than they were to change the Passover. They were told why to do it, how to do it, what it was composed of, when to do it, and so are we with the Lord's Supper. We're told the same things. It helped us to remember. The bitter herbs helped them remember. The unleavened bread helped them remember. Helped them remember. And so it's very similar for us today. Most of us know the story of them leaving, of course, and God providentially, miraculously parting the sea so that all of those people can go over. Certainly in the millions of people. The exact number is not given. We know how many adults went over, but that didn't count the children. So, even if every household just had 2 children, and they probably had more, then it was well into the millions of people that passed through. A very amazing miracle. All right. Now, some of the significance for us. Let's first of all go to John chapter 1. And let's see. John chapter 1, verse 29. Would someone read that for us?
The next day John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world."
The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. We go back to Isaiah 53. Let's go back there very quickly. This, of course, is the chapter in Isaiah about the Messiah and what was going to happen to him. Would someone read Isaiah 53 verse 7 when they get there?
He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth.
All right. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. So many times Jesus is said to be the Lamb of God, the Lamb that was shed for the remission of our sins. And when Paul wrote about it, he used this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians 5, verse, I think it's 7. Yeah, would someone read verse 7? 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7.
Therefore purge out the old leaven, and that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us.
Okay, there again, Christ is called our Passover, our Paschal Lamb. That's what He was. And what did He cause to happen? Well, the Passover, remember, was a deliverance from Egyptian bondage. The blood over the post, the lintel, was to keep death from entering the household. Well, that's what Jesus did for us. That's what He did for us. Let's look at Romans 6:6. Someone wants to read that for us, Romans 6:6.
For we know that our old self was crucified with Him, so that the body of sin might be done away with.
Go ahead, finish that, yeah.
That we should no longer be slaves to sin.
All right, our old man was crucified with Him, with Christ, that we should no longer be slaves of sin, and the body of sin might be done away with. And why? Because of His blood. It's in Christ we have redemption through His blood. Ephesians 1 verse 7. So His blood, just like that blood had great significance, it kept death from entering the house. Jesus' blood keeps death, spiritual death, from, you might say, entering our house. That's what He did. And of course we know that that blood had to be put on the doorpost. People couldn't just say, well, I was going to put blood on the doorpost, or I'm sure that was a good idea to put it on the doorpost. No, they had to actually do it. They had to actually do it. And then death would pass over. And so for us, we come in contact with His blood when we're immersed. And again, it is for a reason. We have to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it. That's when our sins are washed away. Not because there is magic in the water or magic in anything like that. It's because that's when God said it was going to happen. I suppose God could have told the Israelites all kinds of things to do, but He told them to take blood from the lamb that was sacrificed and put it on the doorpost. And then that's what they had to do. They weren't allowed to change it in any way. So there's just a lot of significance between what happened back in Exodus 12 and what Jesus did for us. And of course, we don't have to taste bitterness, the bitterness of sin, because Jesus did it for us. Remember, it says God made Him sin, or to be sin for us. So He tasted the bitterness so we wouldn't have to. Jesus, remember on the 10th day, they would go select a particular lamb. Had to be a male, a year-old male, without spot or blemish. And just think about the times in the New Testament, especially in 1 Peter, where Jesus is said to be just that. This lamb without spot and blemish, who was offered on the cross. So there's just a lot of similarities between the Passover lamb that Israel sacrificed and Jesus as our Passover lamb. So there's just a lot of significance. Whole books have been written about just the significance of Jesus as seen in the Passover. I was reading one this past week, and it was just amazing how much stuff there's there. We just kind of scratched the surface tonight. But there's a lot there for us to look at. I want to go back and one thing because our time's about up. Go one more time back to 1 Corinthians 5. We read one of the verses. We read verse 7. I want to go back and read verse 6 and then verse 8. 1 Corinthians 5:6 says, "Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump?" When you're making bread, you don't have to put much yeast in it, do you? Or people that make sourdough bread, when you make it, all you have to do is take a little pinch off of it to make the next loaf, don't you? Doesn't take very much. Well, that's what he's saying here. Just a little is all it takes. And of course here, leaven is symbolic of sin and evil. And that's all it takes. You know, the Corinthians had one of the problems in the church there was they were not taking care of sin in the church. They were not disciplining people involved in sin that needed to be. They weren't doing what God had told them to do. Then verse 8, "Therefore let us keep the feast not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." And again, unleavened bread, the idea of purity and sinlessness. The lesson is that sin corrupts. If you don't get rid of it, sin corrupts. And he said, the people, of course, back then, that's how everybody made bread, was like that. Everybody made their own. And so everybody knew about leaven and what it did, and the difference between bread that had leaven in it and bread that didn't have leaven in it. So it had some great significance for these people, and a lot for us too. Well, our time is definitely up. Very, very important. Next week we're going to look at Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, sometimes called the Feast of Harvest. And of course, a lot happens on Pentecost in the New Testament. But understanding the Jewish background to it, I think, will be really helpful.